So at least in theory, this is now live. And it's not just live, it is actually real-time live. You are in my office here at Berkeley. I'm sitting with you, and we're talking. Except the camera keeps moving. The camera keeps moving. You have to understand, this is sort of a test. This is an experimental version of what we are trying to do, and it's not clear that it's working. But the purpose of doing it live, are you still with me? Okay, the purpose of doing this live and in real time is to both give me the opportunity to talk to you, also to give you the opportunity to ask me questions. So it's like a town meeting, a virtual town meeting. I can get off my chest some of the things that I have been kind of particularly concerned about, like Donald Trump's antics over the past, well, for a long time, but last night or yesterday when Donald Trump said effectively that what we need to do is treat Muslims as if they are suspects, even American Muslims. They have to submit data on where they are and who they are, and they've got to be tracked. And he said he would not be adverse. In fact, he might consider even having them wear identification badges. And doesn't this sound strangely, weirdly, horrifying close to what was done in Nazi Germany? Now, the purpose of this session is not for me to go off on Donald Trump. The purpose of the session is for me to read from my book, Saving Capitalism for the Many, Not the Few, which I will do, but I want to try to blend the themes of the book into what's happening with regard to our culture and politics and so on. So, first of all, I'm going to read right now. Okay, here it comes. It's likely that in coming years, the major fault line in American politics will shift from Democrat versus Republican to anti-establishment versus establishment. That is, to the middle class, working class, and poor who see the game as rigged versus the executives of large corporations, the inhabitants of Wall Street, and the billionaires, all of whom do the rigging. By 2014, big business and Wall Street Republicans were already signaling their preference for a Democratic establishment candidate over a Republican anti-establishment one. Dozens of major GOP donors, Wall Street Republicans, and corporate lobbyists told the Washington journal Politico, for example, that if the Republican Party didn't put forward a candidate supportive of big business and Wall Street, Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, or Mitt Romney, they would support Hillary Clinton. Now, they talk, and I quote them, to talking about a nightmare scenario in which you have an anti-establishment candidate who really does become president. But there really are two anti-establishment types in America. In fact, there are two, we might say, populist types of politics historically in America. One is left-wing populism, left-wing anti-establishment, and the other is right-wing anti-establishment. Left-wing anti-establishment has a very long tradition in the United States. It's reformist anti-establishment. It's the populists that began with William Jennings Bryan, the prairie populists in the 1880s, 1890s, fighting Bob La Follette, governor of Wisconsin, and even found expression in the progressive era between 1901 and 1916. That is reform populism. It's anti-establishment in the sense that it is based upon a determination to change the rules of the game fundamentally in favor of working people and the broad public and get power back from elites. But there is a second strain of populism in America. It is less dominant, but it is still there. And it is something that we are now contending with. It's right-wing populism. It's authoritarian populism. It's based on the same anger. It's based on the same determination to change power structures and get power away from the ruling class. But as personified by Donald Trump and a few others in the Republican race this time around, it basically is anti-democratic. It says, just follow me. I'm a strong man. If you follow me, I will deliver. And by the way, your problems are related to them. And there's scapegoating that goes on in right-wing populism. We see it with regard to Trump's telling us that Mexicans and Mexican immigrants are responsible for rapes and murders and plundering, and also his talking about Muslims, even American Muslims, and tracking them and closing mosques. And we hear Rubio saying the same thing about closing mosques and that kind of ugliness that, in this case, religious bigotry has been a feature of right-wing populism in the United States. Father Charles Coughlin, for example, in the 1930s, was an example of right-wing populism. He was a radio broadcaster, a Nazi sympathizer, certainly anti-Semitic, very politically active. In the 1950s, some of you may remember Joseph McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin. Communist witch hunts, wreck people's careers, that kind of virulent right-wing populism, authoritarian populism, picking on certain groups, stigmatizing, scapegoating, also creating fear and really using fear to turn people against each other, is a significant feature of this right-wing populism. Now, what I say here in this book, and I don't want to give away the whole plot because I still want you to go out and read it, but what I say in the book is that because Americans are so frustrated, there's so much of a sense that the game is rigged against them, that the establishment cannot be trusted. And we're talking about not only the media establishment, mainstream media, the political establishment, and so forth. Because of that, ironically, we have created both the situation in which left-wing populism has a very good chance in the form of Bernie Sanders, but also right-wing populism is flourishing in the form, most obviously, of Donald Trump. And there are no checks. I mean, we've created a kind of circus atmosphere in this campaign because it used to be the political parties acted as a check on who could become a presidential candidate. The political parties, particularly on the Republican political party, are now irrelevant. I mean, Donald Trump and Ben Carson and Carly Fiorina and a few others got in because they nominated themselves. They just said, well, I must be good enough, so I'm going to become a candidate for president. Boom. Presto, I'm a candidate for president. And if Republicans particularly, it could happen on the Democratic side as well, but if Republicans were most likely to have very wealthy friends, those wealthy friends in this post-Citizens United era can simply contribute to a super PAC and therefore provide enough funding for any of these particularly right-wing populists to have a field day to run for office. And their lies, and they are telling lies, are not checked. It used to be when we trusted the media, when a lot of America trusted the major media to fact check and to ride herd over the claims that a candidate makes about his background, his qualifications, even his political proposals. That acted as a little bit of a filter, a little bit of a check. But these days, there is none. We have candidates saying things about themselves. Ben Carson says he went to West Point. He was admitted to West Point. Not that he went to West Point, but he was admitted to West Point, that are obviously false, but don't seem dramatically to affect the poll ratings. Donald Trump lies through his teeth. But it seems that nobody cares because nobody trusts a third-party mediator, arbitrator, filter to stop and say, no, that is a lie, and that person must not get away with it. The other aspect of this same right-wing populism that we're seeing is that the hatefulness, the divisiveness, the bigotry doesn't have a check on it. I mean, at least when Joe McCarthy was going on his communist witch hunts, there was Edward R. Murrow, a distinguished commentator who stood up to McCarthy and who was able to expose him for the demagogue he was. When George Wallace, Alabama Governor George Wallace, was running on a segregationist platform in 1968, there were any number of faith-based leaders, clergy, college presidents, others, who stood up and said, no, this is not what America is about. We want civil rights. We want voting rights. We are intending, the Supreme Court has told us, and we are intending to give up that kind of segregation. They really put George Wallace in his place, just as Edward R. Murrow put Joe McCarthy in his place. But right now, when we have Donald Trump sounding off, and Rubio and others about Muslims, there doesn't seem to be that kind of opinion leader to put these people in their places, to stand up and say this is demagoguery, this is hatefulness, this is not America, it's not the America we believe in or anybody should believe in. So in other words, because so many Americans feel like the establishment has let them down, because so many Americans, my book, have felt that the game is rigged against them. The ironic result, the paradoxical result, is that you have an environment, a society, a politics right now in which some very strange characters, I look at the Republican, all of the Republican candidates, they're like a Star Wars barroom. The bizarre group of people who are representing, one of the major political parties in the United States, and has a chance. They have a chance, particularly now that we've seen terrorist attacks in Paris. People are worried about terrorism. That gives them these crackpots, and I really use that term advisedly, in the Republican Party, who are running for president, even more of a chance because of the fears that all of this terrorism has ignited. Now, am I optimistic? Well, I am optimistic in the following sense, that we Americans, every time we have confronted an economic crisis, a political crisis, every time capitalism has got really off track, we have put ideology aside, we've exercised common sense. Every time that we have been confronted by a demagogue, a racist, a kind of someone who is pandering to hatefulness, we basically wake up and we say, no, that's not us. That's not what we represent. That's something that is foreign to America. We represent tolerance toward other groups, other religions, other peoples, other races. But the question is, are we still those people? Are we still that society? Are we still capable of making that kind of correction? When the intermediary institutions, when the establishment, when has been so discounted, and when so many people are so angry. So on that, hopefully, somewhat upbeat note, I will end this, at least my part of the discussion, and I'll take your questions. Let me see. One question from Mike Wilhelm. Mike, I'm so glad you're there. There may be only 3 of you out there, for all I know. Mike Wilhelm, at least you're there. How do we get more qualified Republican presidential candidates, you ask? Well, I think it is important that every Republican, every registered Republican, and a lot of people who are independents, who are basically thumbing their nose at both major parties, participate in a larger and more constructive way. On my book tour, I met many people who called themselves conservative Republicans who were enormously responsible and wanted to get rid of crony capitalism, wanted to reform our democracy, get big money out of democracy, and were appalled at what Donald Trump was then saying about Mexicans. But these people have got to become more active in the party. And independents, I urge you also, to take a larger role, to go into the Republican Party. Look, even we Democrats have a stake in making sure that that both of the major parties in the United States are functioning as responsible entities. Anyway, Wilhelm, I hope I answered your question a little bit. D.C. Worthington, rather than say something is bad, Trump is bad, wouldn't it be better to create a new federal employment classification? Uber. Oh, Uber. Sorry. Rather than saying Uber is bad, well, wouldn't it be better to create a new federal employment classification? Yes. I've written about that. I think that the test we have for full-time employment, whether a company has misclassified a full-time employee as an independent contractor, is too cumbersome, too confused. Right now, the Labor Department uses one set of classifications. Certain states are using a different set of classifications, and now comes the share economy, and it makes it even more confusing. I think it ought to be a very simple test, and the test is this. If more than, let's say, 60% of your income comes from a single source, so if you are an Uber driver and Uber is actually providing more than 60% of your income, then that source is, by definition, presumed to be your employer. That source is responsible for protecting you with regard to all of the employment protections that were developed in the 20th century and the little bit we have in the 21st century. Another test would be your time. If more than 60%, let's say, of your time on a job comes from one particular source and one particular employer, then that employer should be deemed your employer for the purposes of all of the labor protections that you're entitled to. I hope that's answered your questions. There's a lot of litigation. If I were going to advise Uber on this, by the way, I would say, Uber, you are going to be paying so much with regard to so many different kinds of standards for what is an employer, what's an independent contractor around the country, in different states, in different jurisdictions. What you need to do is actually get on the bandwagon. Agree that some of your people do need to be treated as employees and are entitled to full labor protection, Social Security, minimum wage, the employee compensation, and so forth, and develop a test such as the test that I have suggested. Another question. This is from Xander Bremer, and you want to know, should there be a maximum wage just like a minimum wage? And what would that maximum wage be? Well, we used to have the equivalent of a maximum wage when, under Dwight Eisenhower, who was a Republican president, former general of the United States in the 1950s, the top marginal income tax rate was 91%. Now, when you have a top marginal income tax rate that's 91%, that almost acts as a maximum income. Yes, even after deductions and tax credits, it still is a very, very high tax rate on people at the very top. And the irony is that in those days, the 1950s and 1960s, the people who were at the very top were not nearly as far away from the median as people are today who are at the very top. So I think that, yes, we could have a high tax rate on that highest classification, that highest marginal dollar. The other thing we could do is something that Bill Clinton suggested doing. Excuse me, I think that must be the president. He calls me at this hour every day, and I just have to. It is the president, and I'm going to shut this. Mr. President, I cannot talk to you now, and I'm sorry. I'm in the middle of doing something for Facebook. But the other thing we could do is have corporations, and this was Bill Clinton's idea. You cannot deduct CEO pay or anybody's pay over $1 million from your corporate income. That also, it's not exactly a maximum income, but it does deter and acts as a deterrent for corporations to provide exorbitant pay. Now, that idea, unfortunately, never got put into effect. I think the president is calling back again. Mr. President, I really no. I don't care what is happening. The Middle East, I'm not an expert on, for one thing, and you have an economic problem. I can't deal with that. All right, call back in an hour. Thank you. This is a flip phone, by the way. I don't use a 21st century phone. Any other questions? This is coming. Oh, this is from the president. No, it's actually from Josh Bernstein. And Josh, you want to know, would American corporations be better able to compete internationally if we had Medicare for all? I believe they would, yes, because a lot of companies now provide employee health insurance. They feel that they have to provide that employee health insurance because they're providing, and we're talking about providing it to middle-level employees. A lot of companies, even that provide it to middle-level employees, are not providing employee health insurance to their low-wage employees, but they're providing employee health insurance to middle-range employees, the low-range executives, the low-range white-collar employees. And they feel that they've got to do that in order to attract the people they need, the people that they want. If we had Medicare for all, employers would not have to do that. That would save employers a bundle of money. The other point about a single-payer system is we know it's just much cheaper than a system that relies on private for-profit health insurers, who are, by the way, merging like mad and who are even intent on getting greater profits because of those kinds of mergers. So that means that corporations would do even better, and average Americans would do better. I frankly don't understand why we, almost alone of every major advanced country, do not have a single-payer system or Medicare for all. Bernie Sanders has been pushing this. I think Bernie is absolutely right. I don't even understand why Hillary Clinton refuses this. And in fact, a couple of days ago said that Bernie Sanders was going to cost American taxpayers huge amounts of money with his Medicare for all single-payer system. That's just not true, because it's going to mean that everybody pays so much less for their health care that even though their taxes may go up a little bit, they're going to come out way ahead. And this is something that we've got to do. I mean, if we don't do it in 2016 or 2018, it's almost invariable. It's inevitable. We will do it because there's no way we can continue to afford healthcare costs going up. Not as fast as they were going up before, but they are still going up very, very quickly. Here is another question, and this question is from Sandy O'Brien. And Sandy, you ask, can you explain, that is, can I explain, why the flat tax is not a good idea? The flat tax is not a good idea because it means that every high-income person who's now paying under a progressive tax system, a tax that is tax rate higher than a low-income person pays, that high-income person would pay a lower rate, and every low-income person would pay a higher rate. That's how you get a flat tax. Right now, high-income people are paying a relatively higher rate. Low-income people are paying a much lower rate. So in order to flatten the tax, it means that you're going to have a much more regressive system where the tax bite out of a wealthy person's income is going to be much, much less than the tax bite out of a very poor person's or a low-income person's income. It's a bad idea. Don't believe anybody who is peddling the flat tax idea. The other thing you ought to be aware of is that most of the flat tax peddlers want to keep the mortgage interest deduction intact. Well, that's even a bigger sop to the wealthy. 80% of the benefits of the mortgage interest deduction go to people whose incomes are over $100,000 a year. Most low-income people, if they own their home, don't get much out of the mortgage interest deduction, and most low-income people actually are renting. They are not owning. So on both grounds, flat tax being regressive, and also the peddlers of the flat tax very often wanting to include, not give away, but include and keep the mortgage interest deduction. It's a very regressive, very bad idea for most people. I am going to have to leave, but I want to do this again. Actually, why don't we do this? I don't know that this is a good idea. I don't know that this has been helpful to you. It is a live, real-time broadcast. The president couldn't get through to me. There are people who are obviously annoyed. So you let me know and write in. Tell me whether this has been useful for you and whether you'd like to do this again. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great weekend. And keep fighting the good fight. Don't give up.